Okay, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? My name is Sergey Radchenko. I am the Wilson Schmidt Professor at this wonderful institution. And also, and more usefully for the purpose of today's faculty panel, I'm the academic director of the Bologna Institute for Policy Research. That's why I preside at so many of these events, okay, in case you wondered. Although, well, okay. I'm always looking for other people to preside, but nevertheless, we have a tradition at SAIS Europe to have something like an opening panel where you have members of faculty who are currently here present their views on a range of issues without necessarily preparing lengthy talks. We just talk about pressing issues of international order, issues of security, insecurity, crises, and so on. Issues that the world faces. It's so good to see you all here because I think this is what makes SAIS Europe such a vibrant community. To see you guys here engage with our faculty, that's just great. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I will not say much more today. This is not my role. I must say ahead of time that I know very little, next to nothing about the Middle East. I do know some things. There are lots of interesting things happening in the Middle East. That's why we wanted to hold this panel on a subject that obviously has a direct connection to the Middle East. It's called, well, it's actually called Faculty Spotlight on the Middle East, a Region in Transition. A very broad subject. Lots of things are happening. We have, for once, potentially positive developments in the Middle East, like, for example, Abraham Accords. We have unusual diplomatic developments, like talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel. We have individual countries that are active much more assertively, I think, trying to reshape the regional order to their liking in the way that would have been almost unthinkable before. Certain old style, old powers are out, new powers are in. I would argue, for example, that Russia's influence has collapsed in the Middle East. Why is that? Because Russia is involved in the brutal war in Ukraine. And they just cannot be bothered all that much, although, of course, they retain a presence in Syria. That is something that we all know about. Turkey is a very, very interesting player now. Of course, we have here Professor Hintz, who knows much more about it. But from my perspective, I see Turkey emerging as a very powerful regional player. Erdogan, after winning fairly contested elections, seems secure for the time being, the foreseeable future. He's playing his neighbors. He was recently in Sochi. I think he played Putin very well. I think on the whole, I would give Erdogan high marks there, the way he handled Putin in Sochi. We have Iran, that is a very uncertain actor at the moment. On the one hand, we did have conversations between Iran and some of its Arab neighbors, including those that were sponsored by China. On the other hand, of course, Iran is pursuing its nuclear program. It seems that the nuclear control regime that we had there is on its way to unraveling, if it has not entirely unraveled. And that raises all kinds of issues about the future of regional order. And then, of course, we have Israel. We have a wonderful expert in Israel here, Professor Sarto, who will say much more about it. But we know that in Israel, there have been very interesting political tendencies as of late, and certainly something like a protest movement against policy pursued by the current government. And that is extremely interesting for people like me. But there are other players, including Egypt, for example. What do we know about things that are happening there with rising prices, potential social instability? And also there are forces that are reshaping the entire region, including long-term trends like climate change, migration, and so on and so forth. So this is truly a region in transition. We don't know exactly from where and to where, but this is something we want to talk about today. The last thing I'll say is that today happens to be the anniversary of, well, I won't say the exact anniversary, but today, of course, as you know, Yom Kippur, which is a holy day in Judaism. On this day, i.e. on Yom Kippur, although 50 years ago, it fell on, I believe, October 6th. But 50 years ago, on that day, a war began in the Middle East that reshaped the region in many significant ways. In many ways, making the region what it is today, raising enormously its importance. At one point, actually bringing the two superpowers at that time very close. I won't say to the brink of nuclear war, but certainly in a state of very acute confrontation. Could something like that happen again in the Middle East? Could that be a place where some unexpected black swan event could lead off another war, uprising, revolution? We don't know. I mean, that's something interesting to ponder. The world, of course, has enough problems as it does, and Middle East has more than a fair share of them. Nevertheless, that's something I certainly worry about when I look into this region. We have two wonderful faculty members here with us today. First is Professor Lisel Hintz, who studies the arenas in which struggles over various forms of identity, national, ethnic, religious, gender, take place. Her focus is on Turkey. She's done fantastic work in Turkey, and she had a book with Oxford University Press published in 2018 called Identity Politics Inside Out, which examined how contestation over national identity spills over to shape and be shaped by foreign policy. And she's currently working on another book project, which is going to be published by Cambridge University Press. Secondly, we have here Professor Raffaella del Sarto, who is the author most recently of a book by Oxford University Press, Borderlands, Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East. She has been studying international relations of the Middle East and North Africa, and particularly how those relate to Europe, domestic, foreign policy nexus, questions of borders, power, and interdependence. Right. So with this, I think I can open our panel. Sorry, you've heard enough from me now. It's a long introduction. And I would like to address, I guess we will start with Lisel. We'll start with you. I'll ask you perhaps to talk a little bit and identify what you think are the most pressing challenges that the Middle East is facing now and how it's addressing them. I know it's a very broad introduction, but
how much time do we have? No, I'm teasing. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hi, everyone. It's fantastic to see you. Thank you for coming. This is outstanding turnout. Thank you to the organizers who make that turnout happen. I'm usually based in DC, but I'm here in Bologna this term, teaching 2 courses, trying to convince everyone in this room at this school that Turkey is the most important country in the world. Whether you, and I was saying this to a student earlier today, whether you're interested in crazy central bank policy, political Islam, refugees, gender and LGBTQ politics, de-democratization, authoritarian consolidation, NATO, Iran, EU membership, Turkey has all of those things. So it's kind of a microcosm of some of the dynamics that we're going to be talking about today. I think Professor Del Sarto is going to focus a little more on the regional IR sort of nature of what's going on in the Middle East. I'll focus a little bit more on the domestic politics. I think one of the most important trends to recognize is that we're now, 12 years post Arab uprisings, and we see a lot of authoritarian retrenchment in the Middle East. Within authoritarian regimes, you absolutely have protest movements. I'll talk about some of those. Some have been more successful, some less successful. It's really impressive, I think, to see the ways in which individuals mobilize, protesting against inflation, against the removal of fuel subsidies, for example. We recently saw the resurgence of protest in Syria, which is very, very interesting to watch. The fact that economic crisis, fuel subsidies can trigger, kind of serve as a catalyst to get people out into the streets, despite the fact that you have an authoritarian regime that has demonstrated that it's willing to use lethal violence against individuals. So we're seeing that in Syria. But in a number of places, especially where there was quite a lot of optimism during the Arab uprisings in 2011, that we've seen this authoritarian retrenchment, and that's particularly in Tunisia and Egypt, the sort of two countries where we saw the Arab Spring, as it is sometimes colloquially called, breaking out. In Tunisia, the country where this was catalyzed by an individual setting himself on fire in protest against harassment by local officials, you had this case which a lot of people saw as the forerunner of democracy in the region. This was going to be the case. This was going to be the success story. This was going to be the place where you could have power sharing and you could have Islamist and secularist parties engaging in power sharing. But that has been drastically derailed by the president's 2021 suspension of the Constitution, rewriting, kind of consolidation of powers in his own hands, as well as, and I always think, like, we talk about institutional changes in politics. I also think rhetoric is incredibly important, because the rhetoric that politicians use shapes individuals' beliefs about what is appropriate behavior, how to treat our fellow citizens. And President Kais Saied's anti-Black rhetoric is vilifying Black Tunisians, both indigenous Black Tunisians as well as sub-Saharan migrants who have traveled from Africa into Tunisia, potentially to cross into Italy. And that is something that I'll talk about as well, because I think migration is an important part of this. But that kind of rhetoric has led to an increase in violence against Black Tunisians, where people believe that this is appropriate or permissible behavior, that they believe that these individuals are engaged in criminal or nefarious acts, and so therefore we need to take revenge or vengeance out against them. We need to pay a lot more attention to rhetoric, I think, in political science and the societal effects that have. But that, again, is another indication of the sort of authoritarian consolidation, the lack of security for individuals, again, in a country that was seen as this, first mover or potentially the best case scenario for democracy to take hold. Egypt, similarly, you had Sisi taking over in a coup in 2013, kicking out the Muslim Brotherhood, who had been elected. And you also see an authoritarian entrenchment in Egypt as well. So while we had all this optimism about potential prospects for power sharing, we see that is not actually played out. I also want to flag the case of Iran. We're about at the 1-year anniversary. We're just over the 1-year anniversary of the Gina Mahsa Amini protests. Gina Mahsa Amini was a Kurdish woman who was detained by the morality police and died in custody due to the violence that she experienced. I think it's really important to say Gina Mahsa Amini because she was a Kurdish individual. Sometimes you see those protests described just as Mahsa Amini. Her name, she can't use it in Iran legally, but there may be the case that she was targeted for being Kurdish. So I think focusing on identity politics is very important. But despite massive protests that looked like they might destabilize the regime last year, those have mostly not been successful and have diminished a bit. You do see some protests now around the 1-year anniversary, but it was not the case that the regime sort of looked at these protests and said, okay, we need to make some reforms and we need to reform our policies for women and children. No, that was not the case. In fact, there's a bill in the legislature now to actually increase the fines and the penalties for someone who is not wearing appropriate hijab, and for anyone who protests. So rather than kind of this protest movement becoming a democratization force, we see it as, again, authoritarian retrenchment. So yeah, this trend, I think, is something that we see in a lot of countries, and certainly in Turkey, which is the focus of my my everything. The elections that Professor Rodchenko mentioned in May were highly contested. The opposition, in fact, for the first time, thought they were going to win. They thought that the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, that had been in power since 2002 and that had successively, iteratively jailed journalists, jailed opposition politicians, withdrew from the Istanbul Convention, which is about protecting women and LGBTQ individuals against gender violence, consolidating the judiciary, all of these iterative steps. It looked like the opposition had a chance. I didn't think it had a chance, and I was sad that I was right about that, because when authoritarians have been in power for a long time, they do authoritarian things, and they don't want to lose power because then they're afraid of the types of recriminations that they're going to face. And that is the case whether they've been involved in massive corruption, which Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his cronies have, or the use of political violence against opponents. And that was the case for both of those. So my sense was that there was going to be either a rigging of the elections or a dismissal of an opposition victory as supported by terrorists, which is what the elites were sort of saying they were going to do. They presaged ahead of the elections that if the opposition wins because they partner with Kurds, that means that they're terrorists. And I can unpack the identity politics of that. But certainly seeing, again, you know, as Professor Radchenko said, Recep Tayyip Erdogan is here to stay for another 5 years. So definitely we're seeing authoritarian consolidation there. I think really importantly, and this was flagged, migration patterns are something extremely important to focus on. You know, when we think of Turkey, we know it as the world's largest hoster of refugees. There are about 4 million Syrian refugees. Importantly, they are not technically refugees. They are temporary guests. Turkey has a geographical reservation to the Convention on Refugees, which means that these individuals are in a situation of greater precarity than someone who is legally recognized as a refugee. There's a lot of as we see in Tunisia, against Black Tunisians and Black migrants, there's an immense amount of vilification of Syrians, especially around election time, when politicians are kind of competing to see who can be most anti-immigrant. So that, again, we've seen some spillover into societal violence there. But the flight of Syrians is also something that we see in Lebanon, which is the country with the highest per capita hosting of refugees. Over 1 million Syrian refugees there, also Palestinian refugees, to the point where about 1/4 of the country is refugees. And this is in a country that has experienced economic crisis, inflation, a bomb blast, destruction, you know, and its own protests in 2019 against the economic crisis and so forth. Jordan, Egypt, some of the other countries that are hosting Syrians as well. And then, of course, we have Tunisia as one of these sort of departure points for individuals who are coming up through Africa. So I think really focusing on how these migration patterns are playing out, but also what, for example, external actors are doing. So what the EU is doing in order to try to curb the flow of migrants. What the deals that they brokered with Turkey in 2016, recently this summer in July with Tunisia, with Morocco, some of these other ways in which they're sort of paying states to keep migrants within their own borders, potentially without or perhaps with consideration, but neglect of the fact that these individuals are not in a safe space where they are. So kind of overlooking the humanitarian conditions under which, or that are making these individuals want to leave. So I guess those are the two things that I would highlight, sort of the authoritarian retrenchment post-Arab uprisings, and then the massive migratory patterns stemming, yes, from the Syrian civil war and the fallout from that, but also from climate change, food shortages, conflict, and so forth. So I think those are two important dynamics to pay attention to.
Thank you, Lisel. That was wonderful. Great overview. I think we can now pass on to Raffaella for, I guess I'll turn it to you with the same question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. So I would like to say a few things more from a macro perspective. If we're looking at the region and we're thinking about the transition of the region, Professor Radchenko was saying something is happening. It's in a transition. We don't know where to, but something is happening. And I would just like to offer a few thoughts about the regional order, how it is changing, and what to consider? What are the important things to keep in mind here? Of course, I mean, since the Arab uprisings happened, a lot has been said and written about the regional order in the Middle East. There have been many debates on whether there has been already a change, whether it is changing, whether the changes are fundamental, irreversible, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, since the Arab uprisings, we have witnessed some very important developments, some long-term dictators have been kicked out, basically. Civil wars have erupted in several countries. And for a while, that has changed more recently, but for a while, the antagonism between Saudi Arabia and Iran really reverberated throughout the region, affecting different conflicts, affecting domestic politics in different areas. At the same time, a higher number of both regional and extra-regional players became involved in the region. And among all this turmoil, basically, the surviving regimes became increasingly obsessed with staying in power. No, this is also what Professor Hintz has talked about. But the question really is, I mean, if we're looking at this region today, I mean, how radical and how qualitatively new are these developments? Can we really talk about a new regional order or a fundamentally new, qualitatively new regional order? Now, of course, the question depends, as so often, on how you define regional order, right? And which events you think are important in order to assess change. So just a few reflections on regional order. Now, first of all, when we're talking about regional order, we should not conflate that with orderly relations. As much as when we talk about international order, we don't expect the world to be peaceful and without any conflicts, right? There are, of course, different traditions in international relations. You can look at the distribution of power, material capabilities, and stop there. You can look at the ordering role of external actors, usually the United States. But of course, there's also different ways of conceiving of regional order. And a different way would be to also consider institutions, practices, norms that have regulated behavior among states. Examples, well, the norm of state sovereignty, norms and practices such as anti-Zionism, pan-Arabism, which have structured relations in the past, at least at a theoretical level, right? They legitimated state behavior. Never mind whether the states really adhered to these principles, right? This is a different story. And basically, these norms and practices, they create solid expectations of legitimate state behavior and also link the behavior of actors in a system to each other. Central to all of that is the nature of security relations, right? This is a bit more of the English school / constructivist conception of regional order. And if you adopt such a perspective, meaning you also consider practices, you consider institutions, you consider norms, it gives you a bit of a nuanced approach or a nuanced assessment of the changes that have been taking place in the Middle East, because states have remained the main actors, right? The norms of sovereignty, territoriality, the monopoly of the use of force, which are norms that are regulating international relations at large, they're still valid. Prevalent domestic features have remained predominantly authoritarian, militaristic, crony capitalism. Security relations have remained conflictual so far. Level of regional integration has remained low, and the degree of foreign meddling has remained high, right? And also the Middle East continues to be a multipolar system. Perhaps a bit more poles have been added to that, but it continues to be a multipolar system. But still, I mean, of course, something is happening. We cannot just say, oh, all the same, nothing has changed. That would also be probably a wrong assessment. Again, did these changes that we're witnessing today, did that start with the Arab uprisings? Well, some of them perhaps yes, but some of them perhaps date back earlier to the US invasion of Iraq, for example, that gave rise to increased fragmentation, to the rise of sectarianism, to the rise of armed non-state actors, And of course, that also gave rise to a growing role of Iran in the region. So I've written a paper with some colleagues a few years back where we're thinking about the regional order. And we basically said, yeah, well, it's an interregnum, to use Antonio Gramsci's expression. So it's something that is happening. And in this transition period, some morbid symptoms appear. That is what Gramsci's definition of an interregnum would be. So what are these morbid symptoms? And I believe that one of the very important symptoms that we see are rapidly shifting patterns of alliance formation. Now, of course, as I said before, the Arab uprisings and the aftermath, they fomented a very strong sense of regime insecurity and obsession with survival. The US growing disinterest in the region, or at least the perception thereof, because there is a big debate about that as well. And the involvement of a high number of players in Middle Eastern politics, including Turkey, Iran, the Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, but also Russia and China, further nurtured this preoccupation with regime insecurity or with regime security. But that also meant the moment that you have more actors involved, it also means that every state or every actor has actually a greater menu to choose from when looking for allies. No? And this is basically something that we have been witnessing, is that state and non-state actors alike, they have been entering these ever-shifting alliances on different conflicts, on different topics, which are, so these shifts also occur at a far greater pace and intensity compared to the shifting alliances in the Middle East of the 1950s and 1960s. And I think what is very important in all of that, or perhaps really a novelty, is that allies on one topic, they can be on opposite sides on another topic or conflict, right? And then the next day, everything changes again. And that makes it a bit tricky to keep track of who is actually a friend in the Middle East and who is actually a foe, right? Now, I think that is the backdrop to the Abraham Accords. I mean, these very shifting alliances that one day you have friends and then something changes again, and it's very narrowly defined interests. This is certainly the background to the Abraham Accords of 2020. Of course, they started as a pure security and business transaction. Must be very clear about that. Certainly, the Abraham Accords strengthened Israel's strategic position, and the idea to confront Iran was major motivation for the two Gulf monarchies to normalize relations. It's true that by now, particularly the relationship between Israel and the Emirates has expanded to also cover trade and investments in technology and environment and so on and so forth. What I think is important about the Abraham Accords, which has to be kept in mind, is that they really challenge, they demonstrate the ever-declining relevance of the norms of anti-Zionism and pan-Arabism as these shared norms of legitimate state behavior. And I think that is very important because the Arab-Israeli divide had been a key structuring element of Middle Eastern relations for at least 70 years. So yes, the Abraham Accords have the potential to fundamentally alter the Middle East, and this is even more so should Saudi Arabia join, which I wouldn't bet on that, let's put it like that. No, but it's a bit complicated, the whole issue. And I mean, just to give you some more examples on this shifting alliances, this actually my colleague Edward Sola-Ilecha has termed it liquid alliances, which I think is a very good term for that. Other examples is there was a blockade of Qatar, which ended. Diplomatic relations between Turkey and Israel were restored. Readmission of the Syrian regime to the Arab League, and of course also what you mentioned before, the restoration, the China brokered restoration of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I believe that also the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, together with the Abraham Accords, has a great potential to reshape regional relations because, as I said before, the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia affected many conflicts and many domestic politics. Think of Lebanon, for example, and other places. I think I'll stop here. If you ask me about the losers of this development, I will say something about the losers of this development.
Thank you very much. Why don't you say something about the losers?
Well played.
Maybe you want to. No.
We'll start with that.
Okay. The losers, of course, as I said, I mean, we are in this very uncertain period of transition. You have this almost kaleidoscopic composition and recomposition of alliances. And there are, I believe, two main losers. The first ones are, to me, without any doubt, the Palestinians. Theoretically, of course, the Abraham Accords, I'm talking about the 2020 Accords, they could have acted as a vector to relaunch negotiations, peace agreements, peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, but de facto they have decoupled the normalization of ties with Israel from the unresolved Palestinian question, and thereby also contradicting the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. Now, if we look a little bit of what has been happening in only the last 2 years on the Israeli-Palestinian, in the Israeli-Palestinian arena, we see that, well, 2022 was the deadliest year for West Bank Palestinians in 7 years. Palestinian attacks on Israelis have increased as well. 2023 already we have seen a massive increase in violence, including attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians and their properties, while at the same time the current Israeli government has been expanding settlements or has been approving new constructions in settlements at an almost unprecedented pace or scale. Now, it's true that Arab rulers, they may no longer feel obliged to commit to the Palestinian cause, at least rhetorically, because it's not that they have done so much for the Palestinians in the past, right? But the Palestinian issue is still relevant for Arab populations. And I think that is important to keep in mind. And the second, now perhaps a word on Mohammed bin Salman. Well, he may be serious about demanding some sort of agreement on the Palestinian issue in return for normalizing relations with Israel. But I have my doubts that it will be able to square that circle, because the current Israeli government, particularly the far-right part of his government, and many Likud ministers as well, they have made it very clear that there will be no concessions towards the Palestinians whatsoever, right? So I don't know. So Israel is basically in a situation that, well, it will not be able to, how do you say, eat its cake, no, have its cake and eat it too, right? Because, I mean, and second biggest losers are political accountability and human rights, because, and then we go back to what Professor Hintz was saying, because all these normalization deals, they also take place in this general context of authoritarian entrenchment. And that also means that it's about providing legitimacy to non-accountable regimes with despicable human rights records, no? And, you know, supplying weapons and sophisticated surveillance technologies to these regimes will probably not render them more accountable or less autocratic. And of course, then we come back to also what you mentioned, Western capitals. Well, everybody is much more concerned with stability. Europeans are more, and on top of that, Europeans are concerned with finding alternative sources of hydrocarbons, plus blocking unwanted migration. And so, well, so this is, I think, one a very big second loser, human rights and political accountability.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Professor Hintz and Professor Del Sarto. Before opening the floor, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of questions. I wanted to maybe be slightly provocative here, but Raffaella, this is actually built on what you have just said. A couple of things you mentioned that struck me as very interesting. First, you said that the United States seems to be withdrawing from the region. I think you said seems to be or something like that. It's not clear whether there's some kind of perception, certainly has been since Afghanistan, although of course the US still has a large number of military bases there, which is unique, I think, to a certain extent to the United States. Nevertheless, let's expand on this a little bit. The United States may be withdrawing. I previously vouched for Russia, saying that, it's collapsing in many ways in the Middle East simply because it just has too many problems elsewhere. But one power that seems to be kind of getting in is China, and that is very interesting. Economically, there's infrastructural development, Chinese standards, for example, if you look at Huawei, etc., is reshaping things like smart cities, for example, with the Chinese offering technology for surveillance. I mean, that's really changing the way that some of those places are run today. Is this something that is reshaping the Middle East? So that's maybe both of you could address this question. And another part of my question is, again, Raffaella, you said something in that I wasn't quite clear about. The decline of oil, is that a thing? In other words, some people might say, well, okay, we have been focused on the Middle East for all these years. One of the reasons for that is because it's been strategically important, simply because of oil and gas and oil. That has been hugely important to the Cold War. I mentioned previously the Yom Kippur War of 1973. From that point, it really, even if not before, you could argue all the way from 1956, certainly from the Suez Crisis, there has been great attention by rival great powers, superpowers to the Middle East. But it seems that as of late, because of perhaps the shift towards alternative sources of energy, shift away from the oil, it seems that oil is becoming more and more irrelevant. And you could almost foresee a future when it becomes entirely irrelevant. Certainly MBS realizes that, hence his investments in other areas. So how would you say that? Is the Middle East still important? Is what I'm saying.
No way. That is not fair. Of course, it's still important. I mean, I think that there are obviously a lot of regimes that are searching for other sources of energy. We have, for example, Saudi looking at a civilian nuclear program, which may be one of the pieces that the U.S. can't square in trying to bring Saudi and Israel together. But at the same time, the need for energy is driving, I think, a lot of the rapprochement that we're seeing. Certainly, it's the case that Turkey, it's so interesting. Another development that I think is worth noting is the 180s, the absolute 180s that some of these leaders are taking, right? Where, Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad were very good friends up before the Syrian before the uprising. Then all of a sudden they're enemies, and Turkey is funding the Syrian opposition against Assad. Now they're sort of back to having very close talks. The same with Mohammed bin Salman, who, Jamal Khashoggi is killed in the Istanbul consulate, and Turkey is kind of leaking the intelligence about that, showing that it was in fact Saudi, walking a very fine line because they want to maintain access to Mecca and Medina for their pilgrims, and they want construction contracts and all that kind of stuff too. But and now yesterday the Turkish officials tweeted that Saudi is a brother nation and we're partnering together. So these relations can become incredibly acrimonious, but then for pragmatic reasons, whether that's economics or for energy, they can sort of be respun, and you can tell your domestic audience that this is why this is necessary. And certainly the case between Turkey and Israel as well. As was said earlier, also, Turkey had sponsored or sort of supported Qatar during the GCC crisis. It suffered quite a lot during that time, both in terms of regional isolation, in terms of loss of exports. At one point, Turkey's allies were basically the Libya GNA and Hamas, and that was about it. But again, these sort of 180s, I think, are really important to take note of when it comes to the search for energy, to tie back to the question about the importance. And I think that we don't want to discount the ways in which regimes are trying to find access to natural gas, for example. The need for Turkey, which is a resource poor country, to both identify its own resources, but also become a regional hub, is largely what was driving the reconciliation with Israel, looking to try to be a pipeline, have some kind of a pipeline deal. But then they kind of have to deal with Cyprus and Greece, and that gets a little messier there. And that's, again, another huge 180 where you had Erdogan and Netanyahu meeting at the UN for the very first time, after Erdogan has repeatedly called Israel a terrorist state. So you can have these kinds of renegotiations. So I would continue I would say, yes, there may be a desire for, say, Saudi to diversify its investments and not be so heavy on oil. For environmental reasons, regimes may be pursuing that as well. But I think energy politics is still driving quite a lot of some of the developments that we see in the region. And yes, I think the Middle East is incredibly important for security reasons, for economic reasons. So yeah, that's a very difficult question, but I'll say keep an eye on energy politics. Don't discard that.
And of course, very interesting that when Erdogan went to Sochi, one of the things that he came away with was the nuclear plant in Turkey, which is the first nuclear plant being built in Turkey, as well as this promise of Turkey being the regional hub, helping Russia export its gas, which is banned in Europe, to, maybe to Europe, but through Turkey or some kind of awkward other way.
Yeah, you've got a lot of ties between Turkey and Russia, some that are well known, some that are not well known.
I think they're all pretty well known. Everybody can see this. Okay, this is what's happening.
Yeah, but the level of what I would suspect compromise that Putin has on Erdogan, I think we haven't seen all the cards played yet in terms of what they have. But yeah, personal ties there. Obviously, Turkey purchased the S-400 missile defense system from Russia, suffered sanctions from the U.S. for doing so, has carved this really strategically smart position as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, because then you can continue to sell TB2 drones to Ukraine, and you can continue to maintain your energy politics with Russia. So yeah, I don't, after the elections, and then Erdogan's like, no, we want EU membership, and that's the way that we're going to let Sweden into NATO, and everybody's writing these columns about, Turkey's turning to the West. I'm like, no, stop, read the Turkish media. No, this is not what is happening. Okay, anyway, but yes, so the Turkey-Russian relations remain strong, is what I would say.
Probably.
On China, me on China. No, I think just on oil and natural gas, obviously, I mean, that has remained important. I also think about the gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, which have also reshuffled regional relations. Perhaps oil is no longer that important for the United States, right? That is certainly true. But it has remained very important for Europe. It has remained, and for China, obviously, and for, generally speaking, I mean, I don't think that that the importance of oil will decline very fastly. I mean, I think that moment that there will be no more oil production, I mean, then the Middle East will be a different place. I'm sure about that, right? But not for the time being. As regards China, I mean, again, I mean, if I'm thinking about accountability in human rights, of course, China and Russia are both not asking for any type of political reforms. The Europeans somehow talked about it, but didn't follow through on them either, right? But China has certainly increased its role. I mean, not only economic, but also, I mean, if we're thinking about this reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was brokered by China and took many by surprise, right? It was something that,
diplomatic stroke.
It was exactly. So quite some diplomatic activities there as well. And I also think it's important to keep in mind that China is building or buying a lot of ports in the region, along the Mediterranean, which is obviously in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. I recently saw a picture or a diagram of different ports where China has a stake in the Mediterranean, right? Goes through the ports in Israel and Egypt and so on and so forth. And
It was really impressive from this point of view. So China is expanding its role. That's my impression. Russia is probably keeping what it has already.
You think so?
I think so for the moment. I mean, I don't think there will be a big retreat, but you're the Russia expert, not me. I wouldn't want to argue with you, not in public.
Right.
Maybe in
okay.
private.
Thank you.
And I had a little a slide that
Oh,
perhaps
did
I
you
can
want to
show.
do-
Just
okay.
one.
Do I need to click on something?
Yeah, probably. Won't open from. That is just. I don't think you can do that. That was just. That's a diagram I also showed in my class last week. Now this is diagram of the geopolitical relations in the Middle East. It's from 2016, right? The lines, some are friends, some are foes, some are uncertain. That's from 2016. It means that things have completely changed since then. And what I love about this is that it says that Palestine and Israel have been excluded for the sake of simplicity.
Chaos. It's a Hobbitian world.
Yeah.
Okay, let's open this up for a broader discussion. Let's say somebody in the back over there. I cannot see, but please say your name.
Hi. Does it work? I think it worked.
Yes.
I have a question.
Can you introduce yourself first?
Sorry, my name is Ruth. I'm a second-year Maya student, and I wanted, first of all, thank you for sharing your perspectives with us tonight. I wanted to ask about the region's ability to deal with the public health crisis. If I just pull up the figures here. Okay, so the MENA region has the highest prevalence of diabetes in the world, and it has the second highest diabetes cases. By 2045, there's going to be, 136 million people diagnosed with diabetes. And then it also has the highest percentage of diabetes-related deaths for working age populations. So I wanted to ask, what is the regional government's capabilities of dealing with a public health crisis like that, especially with a disease such as diabetes, where it has high related deaths for a young working population, and then also the sort of reduced production capabilities, reduction in GDP, and all of the calamities that come with that. And if there is a public health crisis or there's a shift in demands for the governments there, what effect could that have on regional cooperation and regional relations?
Okay, thank you. Let's take a couple more questions. So, public health / diabetes. Yeah, go ahead. Can we pass the mic?
Hi, my name's Robert. I'm a first-year MAIR student, and I was curious if you could talk more about possible U.S., Saudi, Israeli agreement, and why you don't think the U.S., Saudi, and Israel will come to an agreement. And from the U.S. perspective, why do you think it would be worthwhile to enhance the Saudi-U.S. security relationship going forward, besides the possible avoiding a closer relationship with China, Saudi? Thanks.
Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Sumaya. I'm a first-year Maya student, and I want to ask more about the Abraham Accords in Palestine, Israel. And my question is, how successful are the Abraham Accords if they continue to legitimize, and normalize further the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine and their apartheid regime?
Okay, let's start. We got
Quite a
a number of big questions here.
tiny questions that you can answer with 2 words. So I think I take the one with Israel Palestine, and perhaps something on the Abraham Accords, or Saudi Arabia joining or not joining. Well, I think that was a bit my point about saying the Abraham Accords could have led to the renewal of negotiations, right? But they did not. And what they actually did, I mean, it was pure security and business transaction of behind that. revolving around US weapons and favors and surveillance technology and business relations. So in a way, and that was exactly what was criticized also, particularly from the side of the Palestinians, but not only, that the accords did not, I mean, there was a lot of, when the accords were signed in 2020, there were a lot of, peace in the Middle East. This is now a new era and peace and peace and peace. And critics obviously said, well, wait a second. I mean, this is all good and well for business transactions and weapon sales, no? But it has nothing to do with peace in the broad sense, because the Palestinian issue is not addressed at all. And particularly the accord with the Emirates was basically a reward for the Israeli government to not annex the West Bank as it had planned, right? So certainly it has legitimized the status quo in a way as regards to Palestinians, with the little detail that the status quo is not static if you're looking at settlement expansion, right? Of course, and we will see whether, I mean, Saudi Arabia so far has not, didn't want to join officially because of the Palestinian issue. Now there are these diplomatic relations and negotiations going on, actually already a couple of months. Why I think that it's not that easy, it's because you really have to put, I mean, several things have to align, no? So first of all is the issue that what Saudi Arabia wants is a major defense pact with the United States, which may perhaps not be the most difficult thing. I think that the arms lobby will be happy about that. It also wants a civilian nuclear program, including enrichment of uranium on Saudi oil, on Saudi territory, right? And that is something that Israel is not clear what position it will take on that. Mohammed bin Salman has also been very clear saying, of course, this is a civilian program, but should Iran get a nuclear bomb, then we will also do that, right? So the question is really, will Israel agree to that? For Biden, it would be important because it would certainly be a foreign policy achievement, no? We'll have to see whether all of that can happen before the next elections, no? And then there is Israel, which basically says, yes, we can talk about all of that, but of course, concessions to the Palestinians, that will be very difficult to do for this government, right? And so all these different things have to align in order to, of course, I mean, Saudi Arabia may say, you know what, I don't care about normalization. What is important to me is the defense pact. We don't know, right? And what is also interesting that this time, in difference to the previous accords, the Palestinians have been involved in a way, right? So there has been a meeting, and there's at the moment there's also a Saudi delegation that is supposed to visit the West Bank, and Mahmoud Abbas has basically expressed his opinion on that. But in a way, I don't know whether it's funny or not. I mean, strangely enough, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, has not asked for an independent state, right? He has said more transfer of territory to the Palestinian Authority, more money, and a commitment by Israel to move towards a two-state solution. Now, asking from Benjamin Netanyahu to commit to something, I would be very careful, very careful.
Lisel, do you want to pick up on any of these?
Sure. I definitely think that all of the reasons that you mentioned in terms of what are the potential obstacles to this being brokered, I think those hold. I do think that this would be, as the Abraham Accords were for the Trump administration, I think this for the Biden administration would be a big foreign policy win. And obviously they're looking at elections, and that's something that they would want to be able to show. But as I understand, it's not just a defense sales pact, but a mutual defense pact. So it would be like US soldiers would ostensibly be defending Saudi Arabia in a conflict. And that may be something that can be hard to sell back home in the United States. But I think absolutely focusing on the very, very far right nature of the current Israeli government, and their, exactly as you said, explicit statement, we will not make concessions on Palestinian issues, I think is a really big roadblock. And so yeah, those would be the things that I would focus on. In terms of the public health question, I know very little about diabetes in the region, and I'm not a public health expert, but one of the big debates in political science is kind of the capacity of authoritarian regimes versus democratic regimes, and how authoritarian regimes can respond to crisis. And one of the things that we see is that although one might assume that because you are an authoritarian regime and you can kind of call all the shots and you should be able to roll out a quick plan to respond to a particular crisis, what we saw, at least during COVID, was that that was not the case. And that often regimes had put cronies in place, and those cronies didn't necessarily know how to handle the public crisis that they were facing, right? In exchange for political patronage, you put your friends into government. That's quite common as a tool of authoritarian consolidation. And that meant that a lot of these regimes were not able to address the COVID public health crisis in the way that they wanted to. And it can also be the case that although investing in your population is important from an economic perspective, that the regimes are just not that concerned about the welfare of publics as well, something else that we see under authoritarianism. Yeah, I would just say kind of looking at the ways in which regimes are able to respond. Another way we can think about that, or another set of examples, is responding to disasters. And Professor Parkinson was here last term teaching an outstanding class on the politics of disaster. And she and I co-taught a class the day of the February 6th earthquakes in Syria and Turkey. And what we saw was authoritarian regimes that had really highly consolidated their power, again, had also put cronies in positions of decision-making and rollout capacity, were extremely incapable of being able to carry out search and rescue efforts, to be able to carry out humanitarian aid provision. There was a politics of this, so aid was going to particular municipalities, not to others. Of course, with Syria, there was the case of international sanctions as well. So there's a number of, we're seeing difficulty in responding to the floods in Libya, difficulty responding to the earthquake in Morocco. Morocco only accepting aid from 4 countries, interestingly, although lots of other countries have offered their support and said we're ready to send teams, but they have not accepted that. So the politics of responding to disaster, responding to public health, and which segments of the population get that kind of aid is something that's also, I think, really important in authoritarian regimes. So that's not a very good public health answer, but from a regime perspective and a capacity perspective, I think those are the things we need to look at.
Fascinating. Okay, let's have a few more questions. Let's see, let's get somebody in the back. Well, we got a lot more. Let's get starting from the back. This gentleman in the back right there.
Have my mom ask a question. No, I'm just.
We'll move
Thank
forward.
you. Hi, so I was wondering, like, at the very beginning of the whole talk, you said some little words on like the major things, like what's that, like 12 years past the Arab uprisings, and I was wondering like what you would say that means right now for like agency of more local actors, like the whole sectarian, or like, yeah, like the sectarian perspective, because as you said, Professor Sarto, like it's mainly about, again, regime security, namely that's just continuity rather than a revival of that. But what does it mean, as there are still, like, you mentioned the Lebanese protests, you mentioned like this several wars going on, also what's going on with the Houthis and in Yemen, still also, especially after the Saudi the deal brokered by China with Saudi and Iran. So like they're still very much active local players who have some agency, but I'm struggling sometimes to see like what's their, like how much influence they do have.
Yeah, let's move forward. Over there, yeah, okay, that's fine. Just we'll keep moving on.
Okay. Hi, I'm Carter. I'm a MAIR student. My question is, so given like continued support for Saudi Arabia and Israel, even after their, I guess, judicial reform, you know, like the, I guess, authoritarian slide, what role, like, is human rights concerns and democratic values, is that just like rhetoric for European and American foreign policy, or how can those actually be implemented in a positive way in foreign policy decision making in the Middle East?
Okay, next over there. Sorry, just yeah, that's fine.
Hi, I'm Max, first year IR student. I have a question about how you see the role of the Middle East in the context of the emergence of a renewed challenge to U.S. hegemony by the global South, led by China and Russia. We've seen a lot of statements last year. If you think about the Brazilian president, there's lots of talks, de-dollarization, decoupling from the dollar. I think back to Xi's visit to Moscow a couple of months ago when he mentioned to Putin, we're in the middle of a transformation we haven't seen in the last century. And most recently, MBS declaring that the Middle East will be the new Europe in the next 30 years. So how do you see, and in particular, thinking about BRICS expansion as well. I think they're thinking of including Saudi Arabia and Egypt, if I'm not mistaken. So how do you see the role of the Middle East or specific Middle Eastern countries in this kind of development?
Okay, very good. Let's start with these three. We have questions here about the local agency, whether human rights is just blah, 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 or do they actually matter? And, you know, the challenge to the U.S.
Okay, let's do it. I really appreciate the question about local actors and sort of the sectarianization of conflicts that we've seen. And I think that's a really important word to recognize, is that things are not inherently sectarian, but they can become sectarianized based on the narratives by politicians and the media outlets that they're using to push their messages. And if we look at the Syrian conflict, for example, that starts as a local, uprising. It starts as individuals protesting against the Assad regime, sort of a spillover of the Arab uprisings that we saw. But it quickly, through the use of politicians' rhetoric and the use of media tools, becomes sectarianized, such that this is the frame that elites are using about why we need to crush these individuals and why we need to view them as enemies and so forth. So I think it's really important to think about how those frames can shape the ways in which authoritarian regimes can crush protest. Despite the massive authoritarian toolkit used to crush protest, I think we're continuing, as we're seeing in Syria again right now, we're continuing to see local actors mobilize, use their networks to either on a regional, or I should say like a sub-national or a national level, to push back against authoritarianism. If we think about the Lebanese protests in 2019, those were, I want to say that was like a WhatsApp tax that was initially the catalyst. And then they, of course, as many protests do, become this much larger anti-government frame, right? It starts with one small policy change, that's the catalyst. And then all of a sudden these simmering resentments against corruption and economic crisis and poor governance crystallize in this massive movement. The narrative specifically used by those local actors was, we are not sectarian. Stop defining us as that. This is about justice. This is about corruption. This is about economic issues. Stop telling us that this is an identity thing, and stop using that to divide us when we have all of these economic and governance concerns that unite us. So I think you still see local actors, finding ways to challenge the forms of authoritarianism that we see. But of course, those regimes do make it very difficult. On the human rights question, it can be done, but it depends on committing, not only using the words, but committing to it. So the Biden administration, coming in after the Trump administration, explicitly said that we're going to make democracy and human rights part of our foreign policy, but they clearly haven't stuck to that. And the fist bump with Mohammed bin Salman, I think, is one indicator of that. But to give an example from the Turkish context, there are issues that negotiators will put on the table. So for example, in Turkey, you have Osman Kavala, who's a civil rights activist, philanthropist. He's been in jail for several years, supposedly for trying to overthrow the regime during the Gezi Park protests. You have Selahattin Demirtas, who is the head of the co-founder of the pro-Kurdish party. He's been in jail for about 6 years. So those are names that US interlocutors will raise in their discussions with their Turkish interlocutors, but they never actually, and that would be a relatively easy win, right? Like that's easier than getting Congress to approve F-16 sales to Turkey, for example. And yet the Turkish government isn't moving on that issue. And so I think that there is this rhetorical commitment to human rights, but we definitely see being willing to put those aside. And I think if you look at to kind of go back to the story about migration I was telling, if you look at the transactional nature of these deals that the EU engages in terms of kind of trying to, they call it regime resilience building in their neighborhood, right? As part of like European neighborhood policy, they want to strengthen these regimes so that people aren't fleeing them. But there is an overlooking of the conditions that individuals are living in the desire to try to keep migrants in those countries. And again, that was the case with the EU-Turkey deal, Morocco, and now Tunisia. So I err more on it's an empirical question. You can make human rights a part of your foreign policy if you make that an absolute point of conditionality, but we just often don't see it, and people are looking for the way to the compromise that excludes it. Super quickly, I think there are a number of regional actors in the Middle East that are kind of pushing this counter-hegemon narrative, pushing back against the United States, challenging the sort of Western liberal order, whatever that is. From the Turkish example, this is one that we see in terms of Turkey, angry that the U.S. wouldn't, that the U.S. sanctioned it for its S-400 missile defense purchase, but kind of uniting in this, I'm going to call it a hegemonic masculine populist bro club of world leaders who are, kind of authoritarians who they see themselves as part of this club. And this is Bolsonaro and Modi and Erdogan and Putin and lots of others in that club. And that they see that as an alternative to the US-led order, and that there's a lot of very populist us versus them. You are a foreigner trying to spread your cultural imperialism, and we don't want your LGBTQ Disney Plus content. And we are going to be the ones who are going to offer this kind of pushback against that narrative. So that's certainly the case, at least from the Turkish perspective.
Yes, on the question of human rights and promoting democracy. I mean, of course, the US and Europe have a very long history of pampering dictators in the region, right? This is nothing new. The Europeans arguably have tried with the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership in 1995 to at least have the discourse on human rights enter the picture. And for a while, they tried to put specific issues on the table. I just think that particularly in the last decade, as the obsession with stability has become even stronger, that all the human rights issues have basically gone out of the window, right? If they ever had a real meaning. But I would say that, I mean, at least the Europeans have tried to have to talk about accountability and reforms and so on and so forth. Of course, we don't want to talk about the US attempt to export democracy to the Middle East, which was not very, very, very successful. So, as I said, I think that at the moment, the idea is, I mean, the Europeans have become much more pragmatic, let's say, and I think that the concern with stability is really trumps everything else at the moment. But I would agree.
Sorry. Go ahead. No.
But I would agree with Lisel that, I mean, you can do it. You can certainly raise specific issues, but we also have to put the whole thing into a We haven't talked much about economics, for example, but I think that matters as well. And perhaps that also refers then back to the question on public health, because I mean, most countries at least in the Mediterranean, Middle East, they have been following a very specific development model, in which Europe has played a role, the US has played a role, international financial institutions have played a role, and rising inequalities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is also to be considered. And just on the challenge to a US dominant order in the Middle East, now, I think that's absolutely true. But as I said at the beginning, I think that, I mean, what we see, if you have all these shifting alliances, if you have more players, if you have more choices, it also means that the states have obtained a far greater autonomy to basically choose their partners according to what they like, and to change their minds and to play on several fronts, which was perhaps not something that traditional US allies would do in the past, right? But I think that is something that we're seeing. I mean, Saudi Arabia has not been the most reliable ally of the United States in recent years. No, and that goes for other countries in the Middle East as well. Yeah.
I mean, has there ever been a situation where the US had reliable allies in the Middle East?
That's a good question.
Or anybody?
That's a good question. Yeah, but perhaps a bit more.
Is the US a reliable ally?
Yeah,
That's
that's the
another
other question. But perhaps a bit more, a bit more predictable than what it is today. I
Well,
think.
look, we're almost out of time, so let's see. Let's have another round, the final round of questions, and then maybe we'll wrap it up. So here we go. Yes, please. You're up front.
Hi. Hello? Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Listen now. Yeah, introduce
My name is Josephine. Thank you very much for all these insights. I wanted to ask a more personal question, maybe, because it's been very interesting to hear your perspectives on the Middle East. And I think, given all of your backgrounds, like it's interesting to see the different perspectives that you provide. As a student here, it would be interesting for me to hear how you perceive yourself as a researcher looking at this region. To what extent, like what are the sources that you look at? What are, like, you referred to Turkish newspapers that you were supposed to read. Like, to what extent do you follow local media outlets? What are your contacts maybe in the regions? What is your take on being, like, having maybe a scientific objective distance to the situation, but also needing like insights to actually have an understanding of what's going on? What's your self-perception maybe in this way and your approach?
very deep question here by Josephine. Let's have a couple more from the back over there. Yeah, we've got a gentleman over there in the middle.
Hi, I'm Isha, and I'm a first year Maya student. And you've mentioned economics. So my question is, some Middle East countries are trying to get rid of their economic reliance on oil. So what do you think could be the most important factors for them to get rid of, to reduce their dependence on oil? Thank you.
That's clear enough. Okay, and somebody else. Okay, we've got in the middle over there.
Hello. Hello, my name is Max. You guys were talking about the region as a whole, but I had a more pointed question about one sub-region, you could say, the South Caucasus. I wanted to ask about how, well, I noticed that Dr. Del Sarto spoke about shifting alliances, and considering the recent situation in Karabakh, I wanted to know how you guys thought about the shifting diplomatic situation in the South Caucasus, especially considering the intersections with the humanitarian crises and authoritarian entrenchment that you all made reference to previously. I wanted to know whether you guys see a potential way forward for a democratic Armenia, so to speak, to unshackle itself from a previous autocratic entanglement with Russia, and if at least to perhaps opine about the evolving role of Turkey as a potential pole of power between the West and the East. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's go over these three questions. Very interesting questions. Maybe Raffaella, start with you this time.
Yeah.
I can take the positionality one if you want to think for a second.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Just because the positionality question is
It's a
really,
very
really,
important
yeah,
one.
it's an
Yeah.
extremely important one. And by positionality, we just mean how does your background, your identity as a researcher shape the access to data that you have, shape the, interviewees' responses, how you interpret that, and so forth. And so I really, really appreciate the question. It's incredibly important, especially in anthropology. We pay a lot of attention to that, but in political science, we don't often talk about how, your identity as a researcher shapes the access to data that you have and how you interpret it. And I think that's incredibly important. Objective is a tough word. And I think that, we as political scientists try to be as objective as possible. When you're studying authoritarian regimes, that can be difficult. But, we're interested in finding basically causal explanations for the outcomes that we're interested in. In terms of sources, so my first book was on identity politics and foreign policy, and I ended up using a lot of popular culture sources because they provide this unique empirical window onto debates, often about super sensitive subjects like identity, like the Kurdish issue, like Islam, that as a foreign researcher, especially, you might not be privy to. And so reading novels and watching films and looking at song lyrics can be a unique way, obviously understanding that the author of those materials has a particular perspective on those issues and is trying to communicate that and potentially persuade you of that, but that those can be really useful sources. And so now my second book is looking at actually popular culture, not as data source, but as political battleground, looking at the ways in which regimes and opposition actors struggle to either legitimate their authoritarian regime or to push back against that authoritarian consolidation using media, both entertainment and news media. One quick anecdote that I will share is that as a US researcher of Turkey, that's a particular positionality because there are a lot of conspiracy theories in Turkey that say that the US has been trying to oust the Turkish regime for a long time. And frankly, some of those have some empirical backing to them. Especially in the Cold War era. So that's understandable. I was doing field work in a very right nationalist area of Turkey in the Black Sea region. And I was interviewing a local politician and kind of surrounded with his 30 guys in black jackets. And he turns to me and he says, "I know you're a spy. I know you are an agent. I am 100% certain of this. Do not try to convince me otherwise. However, this means that you are a nationalist, and I therefore respect you." Now we can do our interview. So little heart palpitations at the moment. But all of that to say is I think we need to pay a lot more attention to positionality. I'll say super briefly, the move to, I'll look at the domestic politics of this, but to try to reduce the dependency on oil. One of the explanations that is often pointed to in Middle East politics as to why we have such a prevalence of authoritarianism, and this is debated and there are different ways this is studied, but the rentier state idea that regimes have oil rents and so they can pay off their populations, using economic tools and social service provision as a way to maintain legitimacy or at least compliance. And so if they are moving away from those kinds of sources, do they have other ways in which they can keep their populations content would be, I think, an important question to look at. On Nagorno-Karabakh, obviously, humanitarian crisis that we're facing right now, people are calling it ethnic cleansing. I think that Russia's pullback from the region, as we saw in the Middle East as well, can help explain maybe why Azerbaijan chose this particular time to reassert its control over Nagorno-Karabakh. But it's the case that, for example, Turkey is quite supportive of Azerbaijan. Turkish drones were used in the 2020 conflict there. So yeah, I think if there is a potential for a democratic Armenia to come out of this, there was so much optimism during the Velvet Revolution, when, as there were in so many color revolutions, right? You have this massive uprising and you throw the authoritarian out and you put someone else in place, and then Mikhail Saakashvili ends up just as authoritarian as the previous guy, right? And that was one of the concerns with Armenia as well. So I don't know that this necessarily opens up the space for that. But I think we should definitely be kind of keeping our eyes on that situation and see potentially how Europe is responding to this humanitarian crisis. I don't think we're paying enough attention to it, and we need to.
Perhaps just to add on in the issue of positionality, it is of course tricky to do research in the Middle East. I mean, I wrote my first book about contested state identities and did field work in Morocco and Egypt and Israel back then. For example, doing field work in Egypt, I mean, the book was from 2006, was much easier than it's today, because of course there is also an issue of personal safety, and also your interview partners, they may be put in danger by talking to you. So it is not an easy issue, but it's also true. I mean, first of all, is to be aware that you are an outsider and you're observing things. I think that's very important, and to be also aware of your own identity and your own, to ask yourself, you know, what your own sympathies are and whether you could be biased towards this or that. I think that's the first step. I also think that, I mean, there are some very clear methods on how to conduct proper field work. And I also think that it gets easier with time, because at some point you have your networks, right? You can somehow rely on some people to give you some information, and then some people know other people, and so on and so forth. So you get some of the information from there. Of course, you always have to consider that that may not be the final truth, well, but certainly to keep contacts and to read local news as much as possible is certainly a very important aspect of that.
Well,
Stop here.
okay. I don't think we've answered Ishan's questions about oil, although I think, Raffaella, you previously did say that you think oil will remain a very important
for the time being, I think so.
resource for the time being.
Although, I mean, I think that, you know, the Middle East has of course a huge potential for renewable energy. I mean,
Or maybe just complete death due to global warming.
you're being an
There's
optimist.
There's an article in The Guardian that says, in today's Guardian, there's an article that says that in 250 million years, the Earth will become completely uninhabitable due to all the continents colliding.
Okay. So
Right.
no more problems of migration and all of that. Okay.
Right. So I think we had a fantastic opening panel. Thank you all for your questions. And I would just like to ask everyone to thank our two presenters, Professor Hintz and Professor Del Sarto, with a round of applause. To be continued, please do come to Beeper seminars. I think it's what makes this a very special community.